We're now going to move on with staying with omega-3, but looking at clinical aspects of this in relation to COVID-19. And our speaker is Dr. Adam Ismail, who's Chief Strategy Officer with KD Pharma in Salt Lake City. And Adam, you can share the screen.
Thank you, Martin. Just to clarify one thing, I'm not a doctor. I'm actually not a scientist. I come more from the business side of the background. In fact, I'll share a slide with my conflicts of interest here in a minute. But my talk today, when I had originally planned to give this talk, I was planning on actually being able to present data, interim data from a clinical trial that we're conducting on a specific form of omega-3 in COVID, but the trial has taken much longer to complete than we estimated. So what I'm going to do is I will share a little bit about the design of our study, but I'll also give a background on all of the clinical and interventional research that's taking place right now with omega-3s in COVID-19 infections. In terms of my conflicts, I come from industry, so I'm very conflicted. So you can take what I say with a grain of salt if you'd like, but hopefully I can build a compelling argument for why there's promise in the clinical research for omega-3s. So you've heard a lot about the mechanisms of action that have been presented today in patients who have COVID infections. I think the clinical trials and interventional studies on omega-3s are really focused on these three mechanisms of action: suppression of inflammation, formation of the pro-resolving lipid mediators, and then of course cardio protection, meaning that there's a lot of cardiovascular complications in COVID patients, and so there's some belief that they might play a role here. As Bill and Phil have also mentioned, that there might be a potential prevention aspect as well, where some studies have, or some scientists believe that omega-3s may prevent infections. That's largely not being studied in the clinical trials to date as a primary outcome, although there is one large trial that is looking at infection rates. But I think they believe that ultimately what they want to study is the severity of patients who are infected compared to those that are not taking omega-3s. So really, these are the foundation for what I'm going to talk about here. So in terms of interventional data that's not clinical in nature, there is a drug-wide association study that looked at all of the different drugs and supplements that COVID-19 patients have been taking. And this is an interesting chart from that paper. It's actually in preprint. I don't believe it's been published yet, but if you look at this chart on the left-hand side, you have cumulative severity, and on the right-hand side you have exclusive severity, which means of multiple complications, or the cumulative is of multiple complications. But going from left to right on each of these buckets, you see patients with mild infections, then into the ICU patients, and then into ventilated patients, and then finally those that die. And what you see here, that the blue is basically the lowest odds of having an event in one of those classifications. And what you see here is that basically the compounds that or drugs or supplements that these patients are taking that have shown consistent effects regardless of the level of severity of the disease are primarily immunomodulators, like steroids or anti-inflammatories. And omega-3s are one of the basically the only supplements that have shown consistent effects across all spectrums of the disease here. Now again, this is an association study, and it's looking at a lot of different aspects. But I should note that in those with hospitalization, that's the main bucket that you saw a statistically significant effect. In more severe aspects of the disease, the effect did not reach statistical significance. But because this is a drug-wide association study, of course, you have small patients in some of the buckets here in this chart. So that is one limitation to the study, aside from the fact that it's an observational study. But it did look at interventions, which is why I thought it was useful. Beyond that, there are some case studies. These are 3 case studies that have looked at levels of inflammatory markers in 3 patients who were given icosapent ethyl, which is a pharmaceutical EPA, most commonly known as Vascepa. And in these patients, you can see that after the initiation of the icosapent ethyl, you started to see some reduction in inflammatory markers. Probably the most interesting case study, in my opinion, is again an icosapent ethyl study, but it was a mother-daughter pair that were exposed to COVID at the same time and developed symptoms at the same time. And so they basically followed the same course of disease. But you can see that on the top, the mother that was actually given icosapent ethyl on approximately the 6th day of the disease, and then all of her symptoms resolved completely by the I believe that's the 11th day or 12th day of the disease course, whereas the daughter was not given icosapent ethyl, and her disease continued much longer than the mother. So this is interesting data, and it certainly provides a hypothesis for why EPA in this case might provide some benefit. So that's the non-clinical intervention data. If we look at the clinical trials themselves, there are 19 clinical trials looking at omega-3s in COVID. If you look at that in the context of the entire universe of COVID studies, basically, 0.5% of all COVID trials are using omega-3s. Most interestingly, because we're conducting a trial and we've had some difficulties, getting our trial completed, is how many patients do you require? And I think this is one of the things that I think is really important for anybody considering conducting a clinical trial in COVID right now, whether it's an omega-3 or otherwise. The omega-3 trials require 104,000 patients. These 19 trials require 104,000 patients to fill their quota. But all of the clinical trials going on in COVID require 104 million patients. And so you can see that obviously most trials, there just aren't enough patients that are able to consent to a trial or willing to consent and willing to participate in a trial. So a lot of the COVID trials that exist in the world, whether they're omega-3 or not, simply are not going to be able to fill their quotas and just ultimately won't get completed. And it also creates a lot of competition, and that's another aspect I'll talk about a little later. But aside from just being able to find enough patients willing to participate, hospitals often are running 90+ COVID trials. And so there's a lot of competition for the patients that do come in, particularly when the rates of infection start to fall. So of these 19 trials that are being conducted, roughly half are in dietary supplements, and the other half are in some form that requires a prescription, like enteral nutrition or pharmaceuticals. Roughly half are using a dosage below 1,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA per day. And we know from cardiovascular and other outcome data that dosage does matter. And most of the cardiovascular trials that have been conducted are multi-year trials. And here we're talking about a very acute condition. And I think there's a strong case for needing to use much higher dosages if you're going to have an impact on the course of a COVID infection, because you're talking about an acute condition that can last as little as 2 weeks. And then the other thing is that about half of the trials that are being conducted don't use a placebo. And so if you consider that half are using pharmaceuticals, half are using high dosages, and half are using placebos, there's a lot of trials out being conducted on omega-3s that are not really designed to obtain regulatory approval or authorization to market a drug for COVID infections. And I think this is significant, and you know, vitamin D stands as a stark contrast. Vitamin D got a lot of press coverage very early on for its potential role in treating COVID patients. And I don't know really why there's a, you know, this was one of the questions that you know, was asked of Bill. I don't really know why vitamin D got a lot of exposure and took off, whereas omega-3s didn't. But I do think that from a clinical perspective, you know, there are existing pharmaceuticals with omega-3s, which makes it a lot easier to study, you know, in terms of getting regulatory approval. The one aspect, and this played a role in our study, which I'll talk about in a minute. The stage of the disease does matter, and you know, I would say that if you want to have an effect, and you're funding a trial, of course, you want to pick a population that is most likely to actually show a positive effect. And so, you know, we've chosen hospitalized patients because we think that that's where we're most likely to show an effect. But it doesn't mean that omega-3s won't necessarily have an effect on other stages of the disease. The other aspect I think is important is that, you know, what is it you're trying to measure? And a lot of the dietary supplement studies in particular, but also some of the pharmaceuticals are looking primarily at biomarkers and not actual clinical outcomes. And again, you know, I think it's difficult. The biomarker studies might justify a mechanism of action or support a mechanism of action, but they don't necessarily, or they won't necessarily be used to approve a drug based on omega-3s to treat COVID patients. Whoops. What I've done here is I've taken a chart of global new daily COVID infections from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, and I overlaid all of the omega-3 clinical trials that have shown a projected start and completion date in clinicaltrials.gov and the WHO database. And the reason I did this is I had this hypothesis that when infection rates were flat or declining, it made it very difficult to complete a trial, which is actually something that we've seen. And so I wanted to see where the different omega-3 trials fit in terms of timing compared to global infections. And I should note that, you know, I don't really see any major association here because we're looking at global data and a lot of trials are conducted in single countries. So really, if you were going to look at this analysis, you need to look at individual countries' infection rates. But I will say that the blue box there is our trial. And it was really up until you started to see the uptick in global infection rates in the late February, March timeframe. That was when we started to actually see increased patient enrollment in our trial. The two orange bars here are the two trials that have actually completed and presented and have data. One on icosapent ethyl in Canada, and another study in Iran using a Swiss dietary supplement. So the results of these two studies were, what I've done here is I've put a little bit on the design of these studies and where they were published, so you can go find the results there. But the CardioLink study was conducted in Canada. It did a base load dosage of icosapent ethyl at 4 grams per day, and then titered the dose down to 2 grams per day. And what they observed over 14 days, so just a 2-week intervention, were significant changes in CRP when it was adjusted for sex, age, and baseline cardiovascular risk. Unadjusted, it did show a decline, but it wasn't a significant decline. And then they also saw significant improvements and rates of prevalence of FluPro symptoms. And FluPro is a composite score that measures the severity of you know, viral respiratory infections like the flu, which is hence its name. So that's promising, that you saw reductions in symptoms in overall FluPro score, and then in the body and systemic domain of the flu pro score, as well as the chest and respiratory domain. The study out of Iran was conducted in ICU patients, and it wasn't placebo-controlled. But as the authors noted in the paper, it wasn't placebo-controlled, but these are ICU patients that were, many of which were ventilated, and they weren't responsive. So, there was a control group, but they didn't know what they were receiving, essentially. And so they discount the possibility of a placebo effect because the patients didn't really know what they were taking. These were, they used capsules, but they extracted the oil from the capsules and then fed them to the patients through feeding tubes. But it's a relatively low dosage. It was a dietary supplement using 400 milligrams of EPA and 200 milligrams of DHA in an ethyl ester form. And what they found is, this was conducted right at the beginning of the COVID outbreak in Iran, but they saw significant improvements in the 1-month survival rate. And that's really the only study to date that has showed a hard clinical outcome, but it was actually positive. And then they saw a number of improvements in markers of inflammation and blood gas. So I think that these 2 studies that have been completed to date have provided some interesting preliminary results and are quite positive. Now, with our trial, which is entitled EPA FFA to treat hospitalized patients with COVID-19, we have a drug that is an EPA-free fatty acid that has a specialized delivery technology to basically deliver the free fatty acids directly to the gut and bypass the stomach and any lipase, the need for any lipase reactions to get the omega-3s in a form that can be readily absorbed. And this is a drug that we've developed through phase 1 and 2 trials for an orphan cancer condition called the familial adenomatous polyposis. It's a colorectal cancer condition. But when the COVID outbreak started, we theorized or hypothesized that it might be useful in treating COVID patients because the data from our phase 1 and 2 trials suggested that it reduced inflammatory cytokines. And so we initiated a trial in COVID patients. We call this drug Epispire, and basically the rationale or the mechanism of action that we thought were that it increased the level of plasma omega-3 in healthy volunteers, and we saw this in those early trials. But simultaneously, it decreased the omega-6, in particular arachidonic acid, in healthy volunteers. And so the reason I think this is important is, as Bill showed a slide, I think from 2011, that basically by reducing the amount of arachidonic acid, and then you have less substrate to produce the pro-inflammatory cytokines that are derived from arachidonic acid, and by increasing the omega-3s, the theory is that you would increase the amount of anti-inflammatory cytokines. And that theoretically should help in the cytokine storm that was characterized by COVID infections all the way at the beginning. And as Charlie and Phil mentioned earlier, we believe that EPA and other omega-3s can convert into the inflammation resolving lipid mediators, and so that may also play a role. In our I believe our phase 2 trial, we specifically saw that at various dosages, there were significant reductions in pro-inflammatory cytokines in again, FAP patients, not COVID patients, but it gave us the confidence that we might be able to see an effect in COVID patients. And then the last mechanism was really about reducing those pro-inflammatory cytokines. And this is a chart from a paper that was published early on in the COVID pandemic in the New England Journal of Medicine that hypothesized that reducing these cytokines would allow greater lung function and less pulmonary damage. So the other thing I would like to just highlight on the rationale here is that, if you're looking at immunomodulators or immunosuppressive drugs to treat COVID, really, as I think it was Martin you mentioned, or somebody mentioned that these can often have pretty nasty side effects, and the safety profile with omega-3s is really very good compared to those compounds. So if the theory was that if this is a safe drug and the immunomodulators it provides a similar effect as the other immunomodulators, then this would be a preferred treatment for COVID infections. So our trial, the design of our trial is such that we're not big pharma, and so we don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to throw at this. So we put an interim analysis in place where we'll get data from 30 to 40 patients, and then decide whether we're going to fund the full trial of around 240 patients. I put all the outcomes here, and but really, I think the most important thing is that what we're primarily looking for is improvements in the rate of subjects alive and free of respiratory failure at 28 days of treatment. So I mentioned that we're still conducting the trial right now. It's been a very difficult trial, and I thought it would be useful to people to understand some of our learnings about conducting trials in a pandemic. The first is that this is a very rapidly changing disease, and the knowledge changes very quickly. And so, what happens is standard of care changes, and so it's difficult to conduct a trial when your standard of care is constantly changing. And I can give you one example of that. At the beginning of our trial, low-dose dexamethasone, a steroid, was not a standard treatment, and low-dose dexamethasone suppresses IL-6 markers. And one of the things we're looking for are changes in IL-6. So we said at the beginning, we'll exclude patients on low-dose dexamethasone. But then it became a standard of care. And that made it very difficult for us to recruit patients. And so we ended up having to change our trial protocol in order to increase rates of recruitment. Competition is a big issue. I mentioned before that each hospital might be conducting 95 trials. And so there's a lot of competition by researchers at the same hospital for which patients can go into your trial. Since hospitals have reduced the number of voluntary procedures, they depend on the finances from these trials. So that became an issue. The highest paying trials, some of them which were paying $45,000 per patient, were the ones that got the patients. There are political issues. Favored regulators have favored programs, even though they're not supposed to, but certainly in the face of a pandemic, those things happen. And then in terms of disease transmission, vaccine administration reduces the number of patients, and so it makes it very difficult. So where we are, we expect to have interim data in 30 days, and we're right now getting ready to ramp up to the full trial. So we're looking at additional countries. Right now, we've been conducting the trial in just the UK and Spain, but we are nearly done with our recruitment for the interim stage. So that's the end of my presentation. I didn't upload my slides, but I put my address here, or my email address here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email, and I'd be happy to answer them. But I think I'll pass it back to Phil, I believe, for additional questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. And it's really great to hear about the studies that are going on, and I really liked your dissection of the different characteristics of the studies. That was really helpful. I guess the question is it going to be possible to actually see most of these studies, including your own, through, given the settings and the changes in the disease and the settings where studies are being done? Yeah,
I mean, of course, I'm biased, but I think our trial has one of the better chances of actually being completed, in part because we're not conducting the trial in a single geography, and so we're able to add trial sites where there are outbreaks of disease. Of course, you have to deal with a lot of other issues. Right now, Brazil and India have the most significant outbreaks in the world, but the bureaucracy involved in getting a trial started in those countries is such that we likely wouldn't be able to get into trial sites in those countries until after the infection rates are way down.
Yeah.
I heard one estimate that it takes 10 months even for a COVID trial to get started in Brazil. And so, you know, I think that in general, it's going to be very difficult. I mentioned our trial is running in both the UK and Spain. Right now, we're recruiting no patients in the UK, even though we have 5 active sites there because the infection rates have fallen so much.
Yeah.
But in Spain, we're recruiting, you know, we're recruiting 10 to 15 patients a week.
Yeah, I mean, it's great the infection rates have fallen, but it's a problem for your study. I think your talk really harks back to the previous question from one of the delegates about why, despite all the knowledge about omega-3s, you know, why haven't people done trials? Why haven't they been used? I think the reality for, you know, for vitamin D, for zinc, for omega-3s is actually you have to do the trials to produce the evidence. And, you know, the time frame hasn't been amenable to people doing the trials. So, you know, I think that's just the reality of the situation that we're in at the moment. Yeah, I think Adam, go ahead.
I would also say that, you know, if you particularly what regulators and public health experts are interested in right now are treatments. And really there are other measures to prevent infection like social distancing and masking and things like that. But treatments are really what they want. And if you don't have any phase 1 or 2 data, which means you're basically limiting yourself to drugs that are already in phase 3 trials or have been approved, it really dramatically limits the universe of potential compounds you can look at to treat the disease.
That's right. Yeah. Adam, I think in the interest of time, I think we need to move on to the next talk. So thanks so much.
Thank you.